Hi, my name is Michael White, mix engineer and founder of the MPG Music Production School. In this video, we're going to run the eMo D5 plugin through the paces of a mix session. The eMo D5 is a 5-stage dynamics processor plugin, including a gate expander, compressor, limiter, de-esser, and a leveler. Unlike other multi-stage dynamics processors, the eMo D5 utilizes Wave's innovative parallel detection technology. This allows each dynamics processor to respond simultaneously to the original input signal as well as to each of the other process signals. The result is precision control and transparency without the hassle of maintaining gain stages between each processor. Let's dive right into the session and take a closer look at the features and practical application. So we'll start by having a listen. I want to point out one thing, which is that the eMo D5 is the only dynamics processor in this session other than the L2 processor, which is primarily there just to prevent any clipping of the video recording. So let's start by having a listen to the whole song, and then we'll narrow it down to some individual settings and go through the features.
Early morning, City never sleeps. Call me up and try to jump the gun. Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap, but can't get my loving when you're on the run.
All right, so where I want to start is I want to start by taking a look at the drums and bass settings, and so we'll start there. What I have here on all of the drum tracks here is a layer of compression, and the compression settings are basically the same. So I have the compressor put in here, an attack time of about 30 milliseconds, allowing the transient to kind of push through, make it pump a little bit. We have a 4:1 ratio, a release time of 263 milliseconds, which is approximately an eighth note setting. It's set to manual, but you can also set up an auto setting, which will work relative to the release time setting that you have here. I also went through a variety of different knee settings. You'll see some examples with this, but I decided on a normal setting. You can also use a soft or a hard knee in the compressor. It also has its own independent filter key section from the gate. So what we see here is the snare channel, and we'll start here and also take a look at the gate. So the gate can be operated in expander or gate mode. It can be placed in or out of the circuit this way. You can see the gain reduction displayed in blue here, and then you can also see the blue threshold setting here. So as I make an adjustment on this end, you'll see that shift here in the main gain reduction display. Now, when we use this, we have normal settings. We have attack settings that on the fast side are 0.1 milliseconds and go all the way up to 100. So I have it on the fastest setting here. We have a hold control that goes all the way up to 10 seconds, which is quite long, and a release time that goes up to 1 second. And we have two separate thresholds, an open threshold and a closed threshold, which you see represented here. So when I play the example, if you watch, you'll see the input signal coming in, and as I make adjustments to the threshold, you'll see that both will actually move at the same time. So what I can do then is I can set my closed threshold independent of this, and then when I operate them, I can move them together. That's the basic idea, and that makes it very functional way, simple way of kind of using the two of them. I just set a more or less a release time characteristic to kind of help filter down the gate. I also have filters set up here. So I have a filter on the low end and some of the top end here to kind of filter out some of the bleed from the kick drum. If I want to monitor that, I can do so by hitting the key switch. So let's have a listen to that. And if I wanted to filter out a little bit more of that hi-hat, I could actually shift down the frequency here on the filter. Take the key out, and then I can open up and see if I need to adjust my threshold. So it operates pretty cleanly, very quickly. What's really great about this is having this independent section here for filtering for the gate independent of the compressor setting. So let's listen to that. So I've done a similar thing here with the snare bottom track. And what I've done here that's just a little bit different with the snare bottom track is I have a limiter set up here. So in addition to kind of a hard gate, more or less the way I have it here, I have the floor set to infinite, which is slightly different than what I had here. Sometimes sort of keeping in a little bit of ring. This pretty much takes most of it away, but you can kind of set the floor or raise the floor up, and you can see that setting here. So that's the longest point that it would drop down to at the end of the gate section. So again, I employed the filter here just to kind of keep it from false triggering, keeping it more or less clean. What I've done here is I've done like a super compression on it. So I set the limiter here in addition to the normal compression setting. Now you can see the gain reduction displayed over here for the limiter and the compressor. So I just want to take this out just to show you something here. When you see this and we set the limiter here, it has its own separate release time and a very fast attack. So we can see the gain reduction in red. So if I take this out and then now put the compressor in, you'll see the same gain reduction reading in orange. And if I have them both in, then you'll see the gain reduction, total gain reduction for the dynamic section displaying both in red and orange. So you can see that the red sort of extends beyond that. So this is just a crazy way of creating a little bit of excessive compression there to kind of really pull the sound together. And you can hear the basic results from what I have right there. So that's the basics of it. I want to show a couple of other things on here, which I think are kind of fun. One is actually right here on the room track. So what I've done here is I set up an external send to feed in, pre-fader send to kind of feed in to be the external key. And this is for the compressor section. And this is on the room track. So I kind of like to do this. And the basic idea of this, if I solo it up, the basic idea here is I want to feed the kick, the snare, and the toms, which is what I did, into this to be the primary trigger. So if I select the key listen here on the compressor section, then what you can actually hear the internal versus external trigger. So this allows me to kind of monitor my input signal, which is also great because then I can adjust the send levels accordingly so I get a consistent trigger with the kick and the snare. And I like this to kind of help to pump and breathe the room tracks. You also notice there's a DS setting, and this is not connected directly with the key section. What it does is it configures the relationship of the de-esser section, which we're going to get into in a second here, and the compressor section. So if I have it set here, then it will put the de-esser prior to the compressor, whereas otherwise it would be set to after by default. So, and that would be kind of a typical setting that you would want to compress your overall, get your gain control pretty much in order, and then apply the de-essing afterwards. So I want to show you the de-esser here, because what we can do here, if I'm just going to skip over here to the chorus section for a second, is you'll hear quite a bit of cymbal or hi-hat bleed. And I can monitor this independently. So what I can do is I have 3 filter shapes here, a bell, a notch, and a standard shelf. And what I can do, so what I'm doing is I can monitoring, I can sweep the frequency to kind of find what it is that I want to get rid of here, set a threshold and a range, So if you're familiar with the Renaissance de-esser that has a range control, then this is pretty much the same idea. And I can place this into the circuit. And what I can do is I can set this with the threshold so that it kicks in to help cut down on the cymbal and hi-hat bleed to kind of minimize that through the process of the song. And that's kind of a unique way to use this. And what's really cool is that it all kind of blends and mixes in with the gating and the other dynamics features here. So this gives me some ability to really, just kind of control some aspects, particularly with rooms and drums. It's just one thing that happens quite a bit. So that's just to kind of cut it down a little bit. I've also set up the same external trigger to work to compress the reverb returns for the drums. So in a kind of parallel fashion, I've done the same basic idea, but because I have separate controls for what's feeding into the reverb, I can minimize the amount of cymbal and hi-hat bleed into that just through the independent send control. So that's pretty straightforward. And the same type of thing here with the snare plate, so that gets triggered by a separate bus just fed from the snare track. So that's kind of independent there. And I've also set up here a squash track. So this is like a parallel compression track, I like to call a squash track. And so I'm just running it through little ships to kind of drive it a little bit. And the idea here, a similar type of thing where I'm kind of pulling out a little bit of the hi-hat bleed in here, but I also have a limiter. So in this case, you see the limiter and you can see the separate limiter setting. So we have a limiter, which is the red area here. We have the compression threshold, which is shown in orange. And if we were using the gate, then there would be a gate threshold that you would see here. And all of those features together. So you can kind of see it all happening on one big display here. So let's, what I can do here is I can mute out this so we can hear just the drum squash track. I'll just push the gain up here. So not excessive. I can kind of get a little bit more aggressive with it if I want to here. What I can do here is I can just bring my threshold down a little bit. In this case, I'm using a hard knee. And unlike the other settings for the drums, I've used a faster attack, so I'm using a pretty heavy limiter and a faster release time. So this is kind of getting a little bit more pumping and breathing energy out of the whole thing with the hard attack. And the de-esser to cut back on some of the cymbal bleed. So let's hear this in the context in and out with the drums and the bass. And all it's really meant to do, I just want to kind of mix in enough of it to kind of breathe a little bit of life into the drums. Let's get into some of the instrumentation here. I've got a few other things to go over. I can open up the guitar track at this point. With the guitar track, what I wanted to do was I wanted to kind of cut down on a bit of the noise. So I have a gate here, a little bit of a softer expander, excuse me, to kind of do a little bit of a softer bit of noise reduction on the gate. I have a limiter here to kind of control some of the peaks for the funk guitar hits, and then a compression layer with a faster attack time than what I have on the drums, just to kind of help to pick up where the limiter left off, but a really fast release. So I wanted to kind of pump back a little bit. So let's have a quick listen to that. And I could tighten this up. I didn't want to gate it down. It's really just like a very slow kind of release to kind of get rid of some noise that happens when the guitar player stops playing. So it was meant to be kind of a soft, basic thing. But that's the basic idea of this here. A longer release on the limiter. So that's meant to be like a bit more of a smoothing kind of characteristic overall for the guitar. And that's kind of the primary bit for that. Let's move on to the keyboards and kind of take a look at a couple things that I have set up here. There's also something else that I have set up here with another guitar track, and we'll get to that in a second. What I've done here is I want to integrate a couple of other things. So one thing I've done here on this organ track is I've put a limiter with a long release. So I kind of want that as kind of a smoothing thing, more or less. And then a compressor with a little bit more action on it, but a hard attack just to kind of control the sound, tame it down a little bit. What I've done, though, is added in something that's a little bit different, and this is a leveler. Now, the leveler, what its basic job is it's kind of think of it as a slow attack, slow release, very long release level control. So it's very general. You could kind of consider it like an RMS kind of compressor, where it's really working on the sustain aspect of the signal. And what this is meant to do is it's meant to contain some of the movement of the notes, that go in. So if something kind of swells a little bit too much, this will kind of pull it in. And I can set a range here, and you could see this right here in blue displayed. So this kind of shows the general range of the control here. And you could see the gain reduction here in blue. And all that's meant to do is just to kind of, hold in or sustain some of those notes. So it's kind of a series of layers of processing here. Let's hear it in and out. So that end section there is primarily where you hear a little bit of that. Look, actually, there's another example here, which I'll get into, which is right around the bridge section where we get into, and this is on the guitar track. And that just creates a little bit of evenness in. It's also mixed with a couple of other tracks that are doing some other things, but here is what the same sound is in the same section without the leveler. And then one more time with it. And if you're thinking that's a pretty subtle effect, then then you have the exact idea of what the leveler is. It's more like about controlling the swells and things along those lines, and that's so that's a very handy tool, and I found that as a nice way to kind of level out some of the sustaining instruments where maybe some of the swells. This works really well for things like strings and stuff like that, where maybe the swells become a bit overwhelming. It can kind of generally smooth out or kind of give you an overall sustain to something that's a little more evened out. Let's move on to the vocal track here. So I'll unmute the vocal. And what I've done here is set up a couple of things here. One is just like a simple compressor and a fastish attack, but also a very fast release. So it's kind of creating a little bit of an excitement factor with it. But what I have is an auto release. So because the vocal is sort of changing and dynamic in terms of her performance and timing, I want the compressor to kind of work a little bit or kind of follow that movement. I also have a limiter here. So I have a long release kind of limiter. So this is creating a little bit more of an overall smoothing characteristic. And then I have a de-esser to kind of work and kind of hit on some of the de-esses that are, or some of the S's that are sibilants. That's part of the track. So let's have a listen.
Early morning, city never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun. Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap. Can't get my loving when you're on the run. Pretty pages and a worn-out spine. Colored photos and words of love. Simmer down and let me call you mine. 'Cause you boil over when the going gets rough, yeah. 'Cause I used to stop time for you. And I used to be fine with you.
So the idea here of this is if you listen, you can really feel it kind of bringing in a little bit of body, kind of pulling the sound of the vocal a bit together. That was the basic idea. I think I have an S section, more or less an SE kind of section right in the front here. So when we take a listen to this, this is actually something where we can focus in on the S's here and really kind of work the frequency into different filter types. So if I wanted to, I could go to filter type number 1, and this would be just a simple bell. Or I could go to a notch, and this would give me more of a characteristic. Maybe what I'll do is I'll raise the volume here so we hear this a little better. So this will just show the area where this filtering is going to take place. So if you have something that's very narrow in frequency, like a kind of ringing, you might want to go with more of a notch type of characteristic. For something more general, I generally like to use more of a shelving type of characteristic for DSs, but everybody, you have that option to kind of go. Obviously, it depends on what it is. Sometimes CH sounds are a little bit more focused, and you can kind of work more with a filter type. Like a bell or a notch filter. So that seems to trigger a little bit better. So I shifted this down a little bit, picks up a little bit more of the harshness. So let me kind of take this out now, and let's listen to the full frequency vocal and listen to it in and out.
Early morning, city never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
And listen to it without the de-esser.
Early morning, city never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
And it's really primarily on that first line, but you can hear it there, and then I can set the range control. So when you look at this display, it looks like quite a lot, but the full display here would be 12 dB.
Early morning, city never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
And then, I can adjust the threshold accordingly. Like if I feel that this is maybe triggering on some other consonants a little bit too much, then obviously I can kind of shift my threshold up or down a little bit.
Early morning, city never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
Now, one other thing that I want to take a look at, or just want to show you here, another way to use this. In this case, what I've done is I also have a bit of a slap here, a tape delay that's on the vocal. And what I've done here is I've set up an eMo plugin here with the compressor so that it basically ducks the frequency. So I have a separate send that's coming in on, I want to feed it in on an external. So when I feed in the external key here, it's actually, I'm just feeding it off the same send that's feeding into here, and then setting the threshold. So what I can do here is I can set this to duck the delays so while she's singing, and then it allows them to kind of fill in. Now, I set it up with a very fast release because the pace of her vocal is quite quick.
Early morning, Sydney never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
And listen to it without it.
Early morning, Sydney never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun.
So the difference here is just to kind of create a little bit of subtlety in the slap so that the vocal kind of pulls a little bit forward, and then the slaps kind of do what they're meant to do, which is to kind of slap back. Because the vocal's so busy, this was just kind of an idea I thought was kind of cool.
Early morning, Sydney never sleeps. You call me up and try to jump the gun. Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap. Can't get my loving when you're on the run. Oh, pretty pages and a worn-out spine. Colored photos and words of love. Simmer down and let me call you mine. 'Cause you boil over when the going gets rough, yeah.
And so this is something, just from a subtle effect. Sometimes we could do this with reverbs. I kind of like to do this sometimes with delays. Very cool idea. So let's listen to all of this kind of back into the mix here, and we'll go over one or two other things with some of the parallel processing chain.
Early morning, Sydney never sleeps. Call me up and try to jump the gun. Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap. Can't get my loving when you're on the run. Oh, pretty pages and a worn-out spine. Colored photos and words of love. Simmer down and let me call you mine. 'Cause you boil over when the going gets rough, yeah.
So what I want to point out here, and I'll kind of start out here with the drums. I've basically duplicated this setup across each of the individual bus chains. So what I have here is a grouping of drums and bass, guitar, keys, and vocals, and all kind of mixed into stems. And so what I've done here, I wanted to demonstrate very quickly the parallel output chain within the same unit. So each of the processors work independently. Their cumulative effect is placed at the output, and that may be a little bit confusing to understand because the individual processors are not entirely independent of each other. In other words, they interact with each other. So if you put a gate, you're not going to get a copy of the gated signal mixed with a compressed signal that has no gate effect on it. So there's a relationship between them, and the total output will reflect what you're doing. But it also gives you the individualized responsiveness of the section. So that gives you so much more control, and the separate key sections also makes for a lot of this. One feature that is exclusively tied to the compressor section in the output is the compressor mix. So when I set this here, by default, it will be at 100, meaning that what we're getting is 100% compressed signal. So what I've set up here is a hard knee compressor with a fast attack 10-to-1 ratio and a very fast release. So it's somewhat similar to what I did with the squash track. So I wanted to kind of take something that really breathes a bit of, puts a bit of air and life into the track. And then what I've done here, that's just to show you full. Now what I do is I mix it back. Now what you'll notice is that the gain reduction, when I have it set to full, it'll reflect the full amount of gain reduction that's being applied to the signal, not just showing you the total gain reduction regardless of what the compressor mix setting is. So given the amount of gain reduction here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to push this up by a dB, and I'm going to have to do the same thing here. So what's happening here, I'm getting a little bit less on the output with the compressor in and out. And that just allows it to kind of even out. Oh, actually, sorry, that's not the best way to do it. I'm also getting the makeup gain. I'm sorry, excuse me, I have to use the bypass here. That'll be a better example. So you can hear the dynamics that's kind of brought in there. I'm going to bring this back to 2 here, just because that's where I had it set up. So yeah, just to be conscious of that, the output gain is independent because it's not the only processor that's operating there. So in that case, a bypass was a better example. And then I have a similar type of process set up here. Very similar settings, only a different threshold, obviously, to work within the context of this. And let's just...
Sitting never sleeps. Call me up and try to jump the gun.
So I'll bypass these altogether.
Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap. Can't get my loving when you're on the run. No. Pretty pages in a worn out spine. Color photos and words of love. Sit down and let me call you mine. 'Cause you're born.
So the idea there is just to kind of breathe a little bit of life into the overall stems of the tracks. So one last thing I want to do here, just to kind of show you, is I want to bypass all of the eMo processors altogether, just to kind of give you a full disclosure of everything that's happening. So this is including all of the effects chains where I have some compression, and all the way across. So this will give you a full A/B of the whole session.
Early morning, sitting never sleeps. Call me up and try to jump the gun. Spit it out, baby, talk ain't cheap. Can't get my loving when you're on the run. No. Pretty pages in a worn out spine. Color photos and words of love.
So just to give you an idea, obviously some things a little bit of the gain, maybe with the parallel and the drum squash and some things like that. But a really powerful processor in terms of working with individual tracks. You could see how just opening up on any individual track, even if you're working with a snare, for example, you don't need a gate, don't need to use it, but you have that available to you. The limiter section, also I love the seamless way that you can kind of work between the different processors with the leveler, the de-esser, the limiter, the compressor, and the gate. And but have them sort of be independently responsible, so that I'm not responsive, so that I'm not getting into this thing where I have to be so mindful of what I'm doing with the limiter settings prior to the compression or after the compression, and do I gate, here or there, and kind of moving these things around and dealing with output levels and one thing affecting the other. It all kind of gets really nicely controlled here within it. Also having the parallel compression mix like we have as a very powerful feature, giving you the ability to kind of really solidify and kind of pull things together. And the fact that they work in relationship to each other, what you'll find is that it's very musically responsive, so that if you do something radical with one thing, it doesn't necessarily collapse all of the other work that you've done. And so there's an intelligence that's kind of built in here, which is really unique. I've never seen any processor, and I'm sure there is no other processor that kind of works so dynamically and powerfully as this does, just the way that it's set up. eMo D5, more than just for live sound. It actually is a very powerful plugin for really precision, transparent control inside of a mix session as well. So just one last point here. I just wanted to give a shout out to the artist Sammy Rae and producer Antoine Patrick. The name of the song title is Stop Time. And if you want to contact either Sammy Rae or Antoine Patrick, you can reach them through this email address, codastar, CODASTAR, @gmail.com. My name is Michael White, mix engineer, founder of the MPG Music Production School. You can reach me at by going to MPG Insider, MPGINSIDER.com. That will take you directly to my website, and you can contact me through there if you have any questions or notes about this. And eMo D5, great plugin. Pick it up.